Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of law and diplomacy in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats or lawyers in negotiating peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by PILPG Senior Peace Fellow, Ambassador Donald Planty, whom I have known and worked with for over a decade. Thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Planty. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to join you today.
Now, Ambassador Planty has extensive diplomatic and political experience in the peace negotiations space. Don is the former United States ambassador to Guatemala and served in this role from 1996 to 1999. In today's conversation, we will be focusing on Ambassador Planty's instrumental role in the negotiation and facilitation of Guatemala's ceasefire and historic 1996 peace accords, which marked the end of a 36-year internal armed conflict. Now, more recently, Ambassador Planty continues to provide expertise on Latin American affairs, European security issues, drawing on his experience living and working in Panama, Chile, Mexico, Norway, Italy, and Spain. Now, let me provide a quick overview of the Guatemala conflict and the 1996 peace accords. The conflict in Guatemala was a prolonged period of political and social unrest that unfolded in the early 1990s, but traces its roots back to the 1940s. In 1944, Guatemala restored a democratic government following years of military rule and coups d'etats. However, in 1954, the United States identified the new Guatemalan government as a communist regime, and in that same year, the United States, via a secret CIA operation, overthrew the democratically elected government and installed a friendly military government. The coup led to a prolonged period of instability and turmoil in Guatemala, with a succession of military governments, mismanaged economy, which led the country into debt and repeated violations of human rights. Increasing dissatisfaction led to the emergence of a leftist movement and rebel groups in Guatemala. Now, the conflict escalated in 1960 when a group of dissident military officers rose up against the military government and attempted to oust the military regime of President Fuente. This attempted coup failed, marking the beginning of a series of coups, counter-coups, and political turbulence that persisted throughout the 1960s. The remaining revolutionaries fled and organized themselves into 4 different groups of non-state armed actors. The conflict in Guatemala continued from 1960 to 1996, marked by significant human rights violations. The conflict resulted in numerous civilian and military casualties, and rural indigenous population in particular faced severe hardship. The historic 1996 peace accords in Guatemala finally brought an end to the protracted and devastating conflict, following 3 years of UN-moderated peace negotiations between the Guatemalan government and the non-state armed actors. The accords were signed in late December of 1996 by the representatives of the government and these non-state armed actors and the United Nations, and marked a formal end to the conflict, despite various challenges that arose in implementing the agreement, which I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss. Now, with this context in mind, let's dive into our discussion with Ambassador Planty. So, Ambassador, you were the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala and played an integral role in the negotiation and implementation of the peace accords, both before and during your time as ambassador. Can you provide us a sense of what it actually meant to be involved in the peace process? As a U.S. diplomat, what were your overarching objectives and responsibilities, and what did your day-to-day tasks look like?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for setting the scene so vividly and articulately. I must say, I was unsure of my role when I got there in practical terms, but I knew in formal terms what my assignment was. My letter from President Clinton, my instruction letter, stated clearly that my number one task was to help end the internal armed conflict, which is what the Guatemalans called the struggle and always refer to it as the internal armed conflict, not a civil war, because it wasn't a civil war in the classic sense, as we will see. Therefore, I designed my day-to-day activities around that singular objective or that singular priority. How can I follow the president's instructions and find a way to contribute to the conclusion of a peace accord, because there was no formal process for outsiders other than those who were in the formal phase of the negotiation, the formal part of the negotiation, which was comprised of the Guatemalan government side, 4 or 5 people from the government, and on the other side of the table, the insurgents or the guerrilla, depending on how you want to label them. And at the end of the table was a UN mediator who, Jean Arnaud was his name, he's a French diplomat. And it was his job to keep the discussions going and to keep the two parties from killing each other across the table, to engage in a civil negotiation. So that was the formal part of the process. I was able to have an impact and some of my fellow ambassadors because there was a very important informal part attached to that. And that was a group that were called Friends of the Peace Process. And there were a number of countries that comprised the Friends group, 7 countries, Norway, Sweden, Spain, the United States, Mexico, and Venezuela. And we were all charged with assisting the formal process, both being available to the negotiators and taking the initiative to help where we knew there were problems or issues. So you had these 2 different structures, and they worked together sort of on an informal basis. Our role was informal, but as we discuss this, I think you'll see it was very, very important, if not pivotal.
Don, tell me a little bit more about the friends of the peace process. Because when we think about peace negotiations, we oftentimes think about, a UN structured process or an African Union structured process. But it sounds as if, this eclectic group of the United States, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Spain, Norway, and Sweden kind of got together over coffee and said, right, let's help out in this peace process. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, that's essentially correct, although there was a formal agreement to form the so-called Friends of the Peace Process, and it was open to everyone, every country that thought it wanted to participate or could play a useful role, a constructive role. And those are the 7 countries that signed up. Now, leading up to the formal negotiations in 1996, at the beginning of 1996, which were organized by President Arsu, who was a new president, newly inaugurated, there were phases of this negotiation, stop and start, since the Esquipulas process was established in 1986. So you had this sort of ongoing effort to reach an agreement, but through a disorganized, disheveled process. And it wasn't until Arsu was elected that a formal process was started and that the insurgents agreed to come to the table, and that conservative elements and civil society agreed to support government negotiators. So the Friends saw an opportunity to help move a process along and advise. You have to remember that this conflict had been going on for 4 decades, 36 years. And so there was a complete lack of trust between the 2 sides, the 2 parties at the table. And the predictions were that this would be a disaster, that the formal negotiations wouldn't last more than a month or 6 weeks because there was so much distrust and there were so many problems. So that turned out to be the role of the Friends. We tried to inject a sense of fair play, a sense of what a negotiation really is. There has to be give and take. You can't be throwing things at each other at the table. There are some rules of the game, and you need to engage in substance. But our constant refrain was trust, trust, trust. Try to develop trust with the party on the other side of the table, which is a key element in any negotiation, but it was particularly important in this one. So that involved doing a lot of different things, which we can talk about formally and informally, meeting with members of the negotiating team on the side, having coffee with interested parties who had access to the negotiators, and on it went.
So Don, each negotiation is unique. And so when the friends of the peace process were getting together and talking with both the government as well as the non-state armed actors, presumably security sector reform, land reform, indigenous rights came about as points of contention. But can you talk with us a little bit about, what were the primary points of contention in the Guatemala peace process and how you thought about resolving or adding value to resolving some of these points of contention?
Well, that's an excellent and a central question. All the subjects you mentioned and others, of course, were up for discussion and were key parts of the negotiation and key issues on which we, as members of the Friends, worked. Now, it's important to know that President Arsu's design from the government side of the negotiations and a peace accord, or the peace accords, plural as they're called, because there are several different elements and chapters to the peace accords. They comprise a little paperback book, and each chapter treats a different subject: agrarian reform, downsizing the military and the military's role in a democratic society, land reform, education and health, the development of education and health, and dedication of resources. So it really, as the Guatemalan government conceived it, was a blueprint for the future of the country, a positive future, to put all the struggle behind them, turn the page, and create a modern democratic country that worked. That wasn't necessarily the vision on the insurgent side. They primarily wanted to reinsert themselves into Guatemalan society and become members, citizens again, without being punished for what they had done, for their rebellion or their acts in the field, and to be able to form a political party and become part of the Guatemalan polity again and part of the structure. And they sort of wanted to just rejoin, put everything behind them. And they weren't so interested in some of the substance that I outlined that was on the government's agenda. Certain things, of course, did engage them, such as the future role of the Guatemalan army and the role of armed forces in a democratic society. That was important to both sides. So those were some of the nitty-gritty issues we got engaged in, and I'll give you an example on our side from the part of the United States on the issue of reducing the size of the military and rewriting their role to not be domestic actors, to a role of a traditional military role, protecting the country, external role. President Arsu came to me and said that there were some audible misgivings in the army, which was the primary armed force in Guatemala. A lot of grumbling, all of a sudden, a lot of questions, and he was worried that this could upset the negotiations in more than a symbolic way. And what do we do about this? Well, I knew the commander and chief of U.S. Armed Forces South, Southcom, General Wesley Clark, was a four-star Army general based in Panama City. So, and I had no instructions on this. I simply told Washington this was my idea, and unless somebody in Washington objected, I was going to go through with it. I picked up the phone and called General Clark and said, could you come up here for a couple of days and help quiet the Guatemalan military? And here's the background. And he said, if you think I can help, I'm happy to do it. And he did come up, and in 2 days, he met with everyone from the generals through to the enlisted people, and just had a presence that, if I don't know if you know Wesley Clark or not, but he's an incredibly talented man, both intellectually and militarily. And he just doused that fire completely. After he left, President Arceau came to me and said, you've done it. This has done it. How can we thank you? So that's an example, one example. There are many others of how the Friends, the U.S. as a member of the Friends, was able to influence the process. And I have to say this in a diplomatic way, but of course, I was the busiest of the Friends, as you might imagine. The knocks on my door were constant, and I was being asked by both sides, incidentally. And just let me make one other point along those lines, and it goes to the trust thing too. After I was confirmed by the Senate, and before I took up my post in Guatemala City, I asked the State Department if it would be possible to go to Mexico City and meet with the guerrilla leaders. The war was, for most of its hottest phase, was actually on the guerrilla side, was run from Guatemala City. The four commanders of the four different units that comprised an umbrella group they called the National Guatemalan Republican Unity. It was based in Mexico City, and they were, financed partly by some of the Nordic nations and the Mexican government, and that was a big sore point in and of itself. But no U.S. ambassador had ever met them. In fact, no Guatemalan president had ever met them. They had conducted the struggle more or less successfully for a long time, and no one had really taken their measure face to face. And much to my surprise, the State Department approved my crazy idea, and I flew down to Mexico City and had dinner with the four comandantes. We agreed to meet at just the five of us, 4-on-1, in a restaurant in downtown Mexico City and talk. There was no agenda, there were no preconditions, and they came in at 7 o'clock, and I think we broke up around 11 o'clock. And it was really that meeting that one sort of reassured me they were reasonable people who could be dealt with, and a peace accord was not illusory. And on their side, I learned later that they were somewhat impressed with the American ambassador, to the point when I got there, they wouldn't leave me alone. Help us with this. The government's being unreasonable. They're saying nasty things about us. Help us with that. So they were at my door on a regular basis. But that's how the process worked. It was informal, it was fluid, but we played, I think, an exceedingly important role.
No, you made some lifelong friends there with the non-state armed actors.
I had to tell him, Paul, at one point, I can't keep coming to dinner at your house over and over again. And one, I have other things to do. Two, it's going to look like I'm biased. Just cool it. We can, when it's important, we'll talk.
No, I think I'm so glad that you mentioned that dimension of human connection, and sometimes just having the right people in the right place. Like, you in Mexico City with the non-state armed actors. When you were telling the vignette about General Wesley Clark and calming the Guatemalans army, it reminded me, I got to know him during the Dayton negotiations on the Bosnian side, and he was there for NATO. But during the Rambouillet negotiations, as the Kosovars were getting ready to sign the Rambouillet Accords, they were very agitated. And Wes Clark, you may not know this, took a page out of the book that you and he had written, so to speak, and he drove them out to Mons, to the NATO headquarters. And basically they spent the day in the bunker hanging about with General Wesley Clark and being reassured that this is what NATO would do in terms of its peacekeeping operations in Kosovo when they signed the accords. And I did not know that at the time, but apparently this was the version 2.0 of what he had done with you in Guatemala, just talking the armed actors down a little bit and giving them a sense of security that someone's got their back.
That's so important, and it's related to a larger issue that you just mentioned in passing before making these latest comments. And that one thing I found really important, almost indispensable, was the ability to pull one of the negotiators or two of them offline and have a cup of coffee, and in an informal session just talk and get to what was bothering them and what some of their thinking was, and to be able to make informal suggestions. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? I had twice negotiated the Treaty on Friendship, Defense, and Cooperation between the United States and Spain, which was essentially the base rights agreement dating from the Franco period, but a very important agreement for our armed forces in Europe. And I chaired the Status of Forces Committee in those negotiations, which was always the stickiest part. And I remember pulling, the admiral aside, or the Spanish officers, and saying, well, let's have a cup of coffee. And in that, I would say, why don't you try this? And he'd say, well, that's a good idea. He said, but let me tell you, your language at this point has been too harsh, and it's really not going to wash. So why don't you try this formulation? And he'd hand me an informal piece of paper. So that kind of thing I put into practice in Guatemala, usually over a lunch at the residence or breakfast, and it paid enormous dividends.
Well, let's pivot a little bit to talk about some of the strategic approaches. Now that you've set the scene with the parties, some of the issues, the friends, what strategic approach did you take or encourage the UN and the friends of the peace process to take to resolve this conflict?
Well, I tried to constantly remind them of the larger picture, of the big picture at stake, in that the struggle had gone on for so long. Both sides had wearied of it long since. The insurgent side wanted to be able to lay down their arms and to reach an agreement, but they were afraid. There was no trust there. They had been severely pushed around by the Guatemalan army, and I was constantly saying, keep the big picture in mind. This is what you're after. This is, in fact, what the government's after too, because going back to a point I touched on earlier, I thought President Arceau was very ingenious in setting the peace accords as this overall framework for the future of the country, and not just an end to the fighting or a ceasefire, some limited term objective, which could be checked off the books, and then where do you go? And that appealed to the insurgent side because they were looking for that. They were looking to be able to reintegrate into a society that they could have a stake in. And their armed efforts had failed to overthrow the government, but this was a new day, a new government. The military governments, the human rights abusers of the past were gone. So it was constantly trying to keep them focused on the larger goal and the end game, if you will, the big issues, and to try to quibble so much over the minor issues. And another thing I encourage them to do, and I have to tell you, neither side had much experience with negotiation, none really at all. And I told President Arceau this as well as the insurgents. I said, start with what you both feel are the easiest problems first, and build and leave the hardest things toward the end, set them aside for a minute, and try to build some momentum by getting agreement on issue X, issue Y, issue Z, so that you could build some momentum. So when the really hard part comes, you had 95% of the peace accords done and agreed upon. Now, who's going to throw away that for 5% left? It gives them, some encouragement to tackle the big issues. So they adopted the approach of what they called sub-accords, and they did exactly that. They got an accord on indigenous rights, which was a separate, and I mentioned the chapters, the analogy of the chapters in the paperback book. There was a formal ceasefire signed, and it was as one of the sub-accords. Agrarian reform was a sub-accord, but they left the big issues like, restructuring the Guatemalan army and its role in a future democratic society to the end. That was one of the toughies, because the generals were not all convinced they really should be doing this, even though they had a representative at the table. There was a uniformed general officer of the Guatemalan army, was a formal member of their negotiating team. So it was really trying to, keep their eye on the big picture, try to bring people along who could have influence in that direction. I developed a strong relationship with Roberta Menchú, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner of some years before that for her work on trying to get a peace process going and for her book on Guatemala. And she, through her, she became very influential on the team of the insurgents because they listened to her and she was a shrewd political observer, and she could go in and say, look, Ambassador Planty told me this, and I know I can trust it, so you should too. So it was more, keeping your eye on the big picture on the ball and trying to nudge the process along. That was the strategic approach.
So get those early wins, get the buy-in, develop an opportunity cost if they
Exactly.
walk away at the end.
Yeah, exactly right. And they liked that, they warmed to that. That worked, and they realized they had some momentum. They had a body of agreement that in fact they had reached agreement on. And all of a sudden, there was less that separated them than that they saw eye to eye on. So that provided an impetus, to finish these things off. I mean, there was one, and we can get to this, you alluded to it. I won't jump ahead of your questions, that nearly threw everything out of whack late in the process, but we can talk about that in a minute when you're ready.
Great. Good. Yeah, no, I'm definitely keen to hear that vignette, that story. Let's shift from big picture strategy to the opposite end of the spectrum, skills. You always hear about, oh, well, this is, peace negotiations this, peace negotiations that, but what are 3 or 4, maybe 5 practical skills that you either employed or that you developed midway through because you thought, wow, as a someone trying to help the Guatemalans and the non-state armed actors get to durable yes, I got to have this skill set, or I'm so glad I have this skill and I'm going to really lean on it during this work.
Well, really good question, and it's a delicate one for me. I want to sound humble. I didn't know that I had these skills, to tell you the truth.
These are your secret success powers, yes.
I suspected I did after so many years in the business, and I did have some experience in more formal, more structured negotiations. But early in my tenure, I had a visit from my friend and my boss, Jeff Davidow, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the American Republic's area, and he was my big boss. Apart from Madeleine Albright, my big boss, but he was my immediate boss, and he came down on a quick visit. I'd only been there a couple of months, and we were just getting warmed up. And he said, "What have you done?" And I said, "Uh-oh, I'm not going to last here. I don't know. What have I done?" He said, "They can't stop talking about you. I mean, they're thrilled. You actually listen to them." And I thought to myself, yeah, I've always thought that part of being a good diplomat and certainly a good negotiator is the ability to listen. And I have to. This is one of my pet peeves. It's in my book. I don't think U.S. diplomats are very good listeners sometimes. I think we fall short on that score often. But it's very important to not listen just to be informed, but to show the other party that you're interested in what they have to say, even if maybe you know what they're going to say or you're familiar with some part of it. But to appear to be a good listener, be engaged. Show that you're making an effort. Don't just go to meetings when you have to go to them, but invite people in, invite the key people in to make sure they meet important visitors who are coming in. Be active. It was 24/7 for me. I remember thinking at one point early on, to get a weekend off, I could go up to the countryside somewhere, to a small town in the countryside, but no such luck. I'd get there, and the media had followed. I had to call on the governor, I had to call on the mayor, I'd call on the military commander. But I relished that because it gave me opportunities to engage and talk to the Guatemalans what I thought was important. So along with the listening comes patience. You have to be patient, and if there's any place in the world, I mean, the Guatemalans will try your patience to the ultimate drop. But you have to bear with it. You have to look for the niche where you can insert yourself and say, well, now it's interesting what you've had to say. You raised a point that I disagree with, and here's why. or you raised the point I think could be pivotal, but you haven't developed it, and here's why. But you need to be patient and to understand that the progress in any negotiation will be incremental. There's none that I'm aware of where there are very few, if someone can find one or two for me, where you sit down at the table and bingo, you've got it all solved in a couple of days and everybody signs it and walks off. It's a slow, it can be a slog, it's incremental, and you've got to be patient with that and interact with the key interlocutors individually and offer constructive criticism, float potential compromises, even if you don't think, they may bear fruit, but give them some ideas. And this is something they were unused to. They really didn't know how to negotiate with one another, and they were wary of new ideas. They didn't want to be embarrassed, and so to be able to do that now, it's hard work. It's hard work, and it's constant, and it's around the clock. But if you do it, both sides are going to take you seriously. They're going to see that you have, an interest in beyond maybe your narrow national interest. And this was another factor that was a problem or a potential problem for me. And it was the fact that you mentioned in your intro, Paul, that in 1954, we overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala, which was doing perfectly fine, thank you. And the Guatemalans had never forgotten that. Unlike us, they remember their history. We're an ahistorical people, but they are not. And the American ambassador in Guatemala had long been both a controversial and a negative figure, because on that day of the coup in 1954, John Purifoy, one of my predecessors, marched into the Guatemalan president's office with a pistol in his hand and said, "You will get out right now, and I have others with bigger guns behind me." This is a true story, by the way.
Wow.
It's written, it's in the books. And so they looked askance at American pastors.
I would think so, yeah.
for some. So
Understandable.
I had some of that to overcome. Obviously, times have changed, and but we're all different people, and each individual has his or her strengths or weaknesses, and it just seemed that it was a good fit for me, and it worked.
Patience, listening mode,
Right.
entrepreneurial in terms of ideas.
Being
Well,
able to grind and keep grinding.
no, it's the whole peace negotiations is 24/7. If it was easy,
Right.
it would have been 36 years of conflict.
That's right.
Well, let me ask you a jobs program for lawyers question. You notice I teach at the law school as well as the School of International Service, so I've got to ask this question. You mentioned a few times that the peace accords were essentially a booklet with various chapters. Did you have a legal team, or was there a UN legal team that played a role in helping to draft these proposals? And this is your chance to say lawyers should never be invited to a peace process, or couldn't have done it without my lawyer.
Well, not true that they shouldn't be invited. I think they're essential. Certainly on the government side, our Sue had a couple of crackerjack lawyers who had excellent reputations, which is something that has eluded many Guatemalan lawyers. But he had two good ones, and the insurgent side also had a couple of good ones. And so they were at their elbows, sometimes in the room, but frequently during the breaks or informally, saying you can't go there legally. And one of the reasons that was important was that certain provisions of the peace accords required constitutional change, the change in the Guatemalan constitution. And that those changes, it was decided would be put to a plebiscite, a national plebiscite. And so how those provisions were written, and then later how they were, converted into language that would serve as amendments to the Constitution, was very, very important. Certainly, the role of the indigenous in Guatemalan society that required some heavy lawyering, and also the part dealing with the reduction of the armed forces and the restructuring of democratic society. And so, yes, it was very, very important to both sides, and they were careful to dot those I's and cross those T's, because they did not want to be in a position of having this laboriously negotiated and what they thought was successful agreement and having it run into all kinds of legal problems and not be able to, pass muster either in the Congress or on legal grounds, or as I mentioned, the constitutional reform was critically important. So the answer is yes. But again, it was a little bit informal on their side, going back to the Spanish negotiations. We did those. Of course, we had 3 or 4 lawyers at the table, one from, 2 from the Department of Defense and 2 from the Department of State. And, it was much more legalistic. And we would, for each round of the negotiations, we'd have written instructions from Washington that you'd better pay attention to, or the Guatemalan affair was nothing like that. It was sort of informal theater in many respects, but it worked.
Now that's Don, that's a good reminder that words matter. You do these negotiations, but then you have to distill this agreement onto paper. You have a
Absolutely.
court look at it, a Congress look at it, maybe private parties litigate it. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Let's turn now to managing risks and challenges. There's always surprises that happen during peace processes that threaten to derail a peace process. And you were involved in a situation resolving a kidnapping that threatened to seriously undermine the peace process. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I have a little PowerPoint presentation I meant to classes at colleges and universities and other places. And when I get to this point in my presentation, I say the negotiations encountered some bumps, but then there was a really big bump. And this particular incident was one that threatened to scuttle the entire process. And it came in September of 1996. President Arsu had already set, and the insurgents had agreed to a signature date of December 29th, 1996. So this was late in the game, and it was enormously unfortunate. And there was a fair amount of luck involved in the fact that it didn't destroy the entire process. What happened was an elderly woman, Olga de Novella was her name. She was the matriarch of one of Guatemala's wealthiest, biggest, and most prestigious families, and one that was liked and was not part of the troglodyte community. They owned the steelworks, but Enrique Novella, her son, was a wonderful guy and very forward-looking, strong supporter of the peace accords. And so they were important partners from the business community side, private sector side, which was critical throughout these negotiations, by the way. She was coming out of morning mass one morning and was grabbed. She was 86 years old and thrown into the back of an SUV and driven away. And of course, the Guatemalan authorities were on it as fast as they could, and they quickly learned that she was kidnapped by one of the 4 organizations, ORPA, which stood for the Organization of People in Arms. They were one of the original 4 subgroups that formed the URNG, the umbrella group. And so their immediate focus was to try to rescue her. And a lot of this unfolded behind the scenes and was not in the media, although the President Arsu called me immediately and told me what had happened. And he said, "We don't know what the outcome of this is going to be in terms of Mrs. Novella, but I can tell you what it's going to be in terms of the peace process. It's over." And within a few hours after that conversation, we learned that the armed forces did rescue Mrs. Novella. They killed one of the kidnappers in the process and detained another one. And they had documents on them that identified who they were and what faction they belonged to and so on and so forth. And so once this became public, it became even a bigger political problem for the government, because President Arsu said, "Look, I can't, politically, this is unsustainable. I can't be." We thought we were dealing with people who would keep their word. We could trust if they're doing things like this. And by the way, parenthetically, it was a kidnapping for ransom, for money. So it was really, from the point of the perpetrators, not a very intelligent thing to do, to say the least. So he made a public statement saying, this cannot be allowed to stand. This is a critical point, turning point. He didn't say publicly the negotiations were over, but he made it clear that the government had no confidence in dealing with this group or coming to an agreement with it. So he stopped just short of saying it was over. In the meantime, my phone rang and it was the foreign minister, and he said, "Can I come over for breakfast?" And I said, "Well, sure, Mr. Minister, what am I going to say? You can't come for breakfast." I know, I had my breakfast had gained some fame in Guatemala because I served tortillas and black beans, which the Guatemalans love, and no gringo ambassador had ever done that.
I thought you were going to say
So,
pancakes with maple syrup.
no, I went native. I went native. So he came over and he said, "Look, you've talked to the president. You know what's going on. You need to help us. You need to tell these guys they've got to come up with, some way out of this, some solution out of this." I said, "Well, of course, we were on a first name basis. Eduardo Stein was his name, and I called him Eddie, and I said, 'Look, Eddie,' I said, I this is your problem, not mine. This is too sticky for me. We're not going to put ourselves, right smack and dab in the middle of this. You're going to have to reach out to them and put some feelers out, and oh, we've already done that and we're not getting anywhere." And I said, "All right." He said, "You need to get involved." I said, "Well, here's what I'll do. I will immediately inform Washington, tell them, about your démarche and your requests, and we'll see where we can go from there," which I did, and I got a quick answer back, very uncharacteristic of Washington, saying that, "All right, are you willing and able to join a couple people from the State Department of Mexico City and meet with the leadership and see if we can't work our way through that?"
Wow, that's rare. The State Department does not get back that quickly and doesn't usually like to handle those issues.
Usually not, but there was enough attention to this and I had made a couple of phone calls to make sure my message would be read. So a small team was put together, and we had some ideas, and they were presented to the URNG leadership in Mexico City at a meeting. And essentially was what the government had asked for, a public statement condemning this, and that it was not everyone, this was a singular act that the other members of the URNG did not know about or agree to. This was a dumb move, and they were denouncing it. And two, something like this would never happen again. The government had also asked that the leader of the ORPA, Rodrigo Asturias, who's the son of the Nobel Prize winner, author, be banned from the negotiating table for the rest of the negotiations. And they did not want to agree to that, but they did reluctantly. So those three main points were agreed behind the scenes. They kept their word. They issued the statement. They kicked Asturias off the negotiating team, and they pledged they would never ever engage in anything like this again, that it was done by a loose cannon on Lone Ranger on their end, and so on and so forth. And that gave the government enough cover to be able to go, and especially with our support and urging that they pocket this. And President Arsu made a statement saying, "Okay, all right, we can accept that, but we'll be watching." But nevertheless, it pulled us back from the brink of disaster because they were ready to throw in the towel. In fact, a lot of Arsu's advisors had told him, who were not very fond of the negotiations either on the right, told him that they wouldn't support this anymore. So, but we pulled it off, and it took a lot of quick diplomacy and some hard thinking, but they put us in a spot on the spot, with not much time to spare. So it reminded me one needs to be light on one's feet sometimes.
And also, you were able to tap into the relationship that you had with the foreign minister, with the president, with the non-state armed actors. You had that credibility. Sounds like you ate a lot of breakfast and drank a lot of coffee over those 3 years.
That I did, but you're absolutely right. We had developed the reason they came to us, obviously, was, or that Stein came to me, was he was aware that we had that little bit of credibility in the bank, and he wanted us to spend it. And so, as I told you, that I had a good relationship with the insurgents, and the fact that I was involved in this, I think led some was a part at least of the success we had with resolving it.
Well, Don, let me end with one final question, and that is, what is the one takeaway that you want future negotiators, either for the party or for the mediators, 5, 6, 7 years from now to have remembered from this conversation? What's the one thing that everyone just has to take home with them and remember about getting to yes and building a durable peace?
Well, one, I would say, stick with it, be at it, don't get discouraged, try your utmost to see the process through insofar as the realities of the situation would permit, but be creative, which isn't sometimes associated with diplomacy, but don't be afraid to be creative in an informal way, and either table language or put ideas into people's heads that they can work with that don't necessarily get, well, they would not have your stamp on it. But a three is to, and this is where I haven't mentioned this, but it was important, but I was constantly urging the Guatemalans to do this, both sides, was to look ahead and be prepared for success and what would happen once the agreements were signed, how they would be implemented. And neither side did this. And it also nearly cost them the agreement, because they realized that this thing would cost money to implement. And the government had done no budgeting for it. Of course, the insurgents were not in a position to have done any. And so, again, the foreign minister called me one day and I said, yes, I know you want more money. He said, look, we're going to put up these reintegration camps where, the insurgents can come in and they throw their weapons in the dumpsters, but they're going to be the real thing. If they want to study to become an auto mechanic, they can. If they want to become a teacher, they can. They're going to be real, halfway houses or reintegration centers. And so we have to build something nice. We don't have any available buildings, but not something, they're like the Statler Hilton, so that they, take up residence indefinitely. Now, a number of Guatemalans, wealthy Guatemalans, have donated land for these, but we don't have any money to build them. We need $20 million. So I said, Eddie, I've ceased to be incredulous when you call me with these things. And it was the end of the fiscal year in Washington. It was, again, late in the process. It was after the 1st of October, or sometime in early October. And I said, I can't just, call Washington and pick $20 million off the trees. It doesn't work that way. And the money's not there at the end of the fiscal year. And so, I groaned and grumbled, and I said, look, I'll do what I can. I'll send in a message and see what we can do. I don't want to prolong this, but the message, I try to give it as broad a distribution as possible, as I did all of my important messages in Washington. And this message landed on the desk of a USAID officer who was down on the third and a half floor of USAID somewhere, who didn't have much to do one morning. So he read my telegram and jumped out of his chair and ran up to see his boss and said, read this. This is what I did in Angola. This is what I put up these reentry camps. And not only did I help build them, but I helped organize the programming and so on. And he was, I think, had one foot out the door into retirement. And he got all excited about this and ran all over the building with it. And lo and behold, to not prolong the story too long, I got a message saying USAID has come up with $23 million and can make this individual available. So I called the foreign minister and I said, Eddie, I'm sorry. I said, I couldn't get $20 million for you. And there was this groan on the other end of the line. I said, but I got 23 million. Will that do? Silence. I could hear a clunk. I think he fell out of his chair.
23 million and a very eager USAID person to get out of Washington and come down.
Indeed. But he was great, this guy. I mean, he was, I don't know, he wasn't a young pup, let's say, but he ended up up being great. And he did this all single-handedly. But the failure to look ahead and see, and the second thing was even bigger, another Stein phone call saying, we understand we have to implement the accords, and the international community, we need their help. We need, $500 million from you and others in the international community to be able to fully implement the accords. And I said, Eddie, you're dreaming. And another groan. And I said, call me back when you have a realistic number in mind. $500 million is not going to even turn a page here. Think about what you really need. You're talking about the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United States of America, the European Union, this consultative process, which the World Bank ran and I had been involved with in the past. I called the bank and said, can we activate the consultative process for the purpose of a pledging session for the Guatemalan peace accords? And the answer was yes. And I said, so he came back and he said, yeah, you're right. He said, we think we might need like $900 million. I said, Eddie, I told you to call me when you had a serious number in mind. Go back to So he finally called and he said, and I said, ask for 1.9 billion. How does that sound to you? Gulp. And so that's the number they settled on, but it was a number I gave them. And at the pledging session in Brussels in January 1997, they asked for they asked for 2 billion even. That's what we did. Back off that, because at the pledging session in Brussels, they actually got 1.9 billion. Okay. 235 million from the United States, 235 million from the European Union, and the rest from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. But they hadn't even thought about this until late in the game. And so planning, especially looking ahead, the financial planning you need to do and implementation planning, they were so focused, and understandably, on getting to yes, as you say, that they hadn't thought for one moment about implementation. And I tried to talk to them about that, but they didn't dare, I guess, dream that far ahead after 36 years of killing each other.
Yeah, you're just focused on, we got to get
the agreement.
Got to get an agreement, got to have a celebration, and then
right.
The day paying for peace. Negotiating
exactly
is difficult.
Yeah.
Paying for peace is expensive.
That's right.
But it's worth it.
Well, Don, there are a lot more war stories, but I know we're out of time. So you're just gonna have to read. You're gonna have to read my book.
We will definitely read your book, and we'll definitely post a link to it when we put this podcast interview on the website. Well, Don, thank you very much for taking this time out of your day. It's been a real honor and a real privilege to have this conversation with you. You played such an integral role and an important role in bringing about the Guatemala Peace Accords. And you've got phenomenal insights that you've been able to share with future peace builders. So I'm excited that our listeners will have learned how to get to yes and build a durable peace. So thank you very much, Don. I really appreciate this.
Well, thank you, Paul, for the opportunity. And you have been continue to do great work and keep at it. What you do is very, very important and very, very much needed. So thank you for having me today.